John McCain's daughter storms the naval archives. The truth about Vietnam she discovers rewrites history. The autumn wind whipped through Washington, D.C., scattering golden leaves across the windshield of Meghan McCain's parked car. She'd been sitting there for nearly an hour, staring at the imposing facade of the Naval History and Heritage Command building. Her father's worn leather journal lay on the passenger seat, its pages dog-eared and stained with time. She'd found it 3 weeks after the funeral, tucked away in the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a stack of old campaign photos. Just 5 more minutes, she whispered to herself, a habit she'd developed during these moments of uncertainty. Her phone buzzed again, probably another message from her mother. Cindy McCain's text lit up the screen. "Are you sure about this, honey? Some doors are better left closed." Meghan's fingers hovered over the keyboard before she finally replied, "Mom, I have to know." He would have wanted the truth to come out. The journal seemed to stare back at her, its weathered cover holding secrets she'd only begun to unravel. She picked it up, running her fingers over the embossed initials. JSM. Inside, her father's distinctive handwriting filled pages with memories, coordinates, and names she didn't recognize. But it was the last page that had haunted her sleep for months. The truth about October 26, 1967, isn't what they think. Taking a deep breath, Meghan grabbed her purse and stepped out of the car. The click of her heels on the pavement seemed unnaturally loud in the morning quiet. A few employees hurried past, badges swinging from lanyards, paying her no attention. At the security desk, an older guard with salt and pepper hair looked up from his crossword puzzle. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "Yes, I have an appointment." "Meghan McCain to see David Chen." The guard's pen stopped moving. He looked up again, this time really seeing her. "McCain? As in Senator John McCain's daughter?" "Yes." The words still caught in her throat sometimes. "I served with your father," the guard said softly, standing up. His nameplate read, Frank Martinez. "Well, not with him directly, but I was in Vietnam. Different squadron." He paused, clearing his throat. He was a hell of a man. Meghan managed a small smile. "Thank you, Mr. Martinez." As he processed her visitor badge, Frank leaned forward slightly. "Miss McCain, there's been some talk about why you're here. Some people aren't too happy about it. Some people are never happy when you start asking questions," she replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Frank nodded slowly. "Your father. He used to say something similar." He handed her the badge. "Mr. Chen's office is on the 3rd floor, room 312. And Miss McCain, watch your back in there. Archives have a way of hiding things that want to stay hidden." The elevator ride gave Meghan time to collect her thoughts. She'd spent months preparing for this moment, calling in favors, navigating bureaucratic mazes, and enduring countless polite suggestions to let sleeping dogs lie. Her father's former colleagues had been particularly insistent, their concern barely masking their anxiety about what she might find. The 3rd floor was eerily quiet, with only the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of copying machines. Room 312 was at the end of a long hallway lined with filing cabinets. The door was open, revealing a cluttered office where a young Asian American man sat surrounded by stacks of papers. "Mr. Chen." David Chen looked up, adjusting his glasses. He appeared younger than Meghan had expected, probably in his early 30s. "Ms. McCain, please come in." He quickly cleared some papers from a chair. "I've been reviewing the files you requested." And? He hesitated, glancing at the open door before getting up to close it. "It's complicated. The documents you're looking for, some of them were recently declassified, but others..." He trailed off, fidgeting with a pen. "Others? What, Mr. Chen?" "David, please." He sat back down, leaning forward. "Miss McCain, what exactly are you hoping to find here?" Meghan pulled out her father's journal, placing it on the desk between them. "The truth about what really happened the day my father was shot down over Hanoi." "We have the official records. Official records can lie," Meghan interrupted. My father, he never talked much about that day. Not even to us. But something changed in the last few years of his life. He started having nightmares again, worse than before. And then I found this. She opened the journal to the last page. David read the note silently, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. There are some irregularities in the records from that period. Inconsistencies that don't make sense. What kind of inconsistencies? Before he could answer, a knock at the door made them both jump. A woman in a navy blue suit stood in the doorway, her smile not reaching her eyes. David, do you have a moment? Dr. Harrison, I'm in the middle of... Now, please. It wasn't a request. David shot Megan an apologetic look. I'll be right back. Please, make yourself comfortable. As they left, Megan could hear their hushed voices in the hallway. She strained to listen but could only catch fragments. Security clearance issues. Need to be careful. Some things better left. Left alone in the office, Megan felt the weight of what she was undertaking settle over her. She thought back to the last conversation she'd had with her father about Vietnam, just months before his death. They'd been sitting in his study, looking through old photographs for a memoir project. He'd picked up a picture of himself in his flight suit, standing next to his A4 Skyhawk. You know, Megan, he'd said, his voice distant. Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever know the whole truth about that war. So many secrets, so many lies wrapped in good intentions. What do you mean, Dad? He'd looked at her then, something dark and troubled in his eyes. Just remember, honey, in war, the first casualty is truth. And sometimes the enemy isn't always who you think it is. Back in David's office, Megan pulled out her notebook and began writing down everything she could remember from that conversation. She'd learned from her years in journalism that the smallest details could matter. David returned 20 minutes later, his tie slightly loosened and his face flushed. I apologize for that interruption. Everything okay? Yes, just administrative matters. He sat down heavily in his chair. Ms. McCain, I need to be honest with you. There's considerable pressure to limit access to certain files relating to your father's service record. From who? I can't say specifically, but what I can tell you is that I have a cart of boxes downstairs that were recently declassified. Your father's squadron. There's something you need to see. Megan leaned forward. What is it? David stood up, straightening his tie. Not here. Meet me in the main reading room in 15 minutes. And Ms. McCain, leave your phone in your car. The next quarter hour felt like an eternity. Megan retrieved her phone from her purse and found 3 missed calls from unknown numbers. As she walked to her car, she could feel eyes on her from the building's windows. Back inside, the main reading room was mostly empty. A few researchers sat at the long tables, surrounded by documents and laptops. David was waiting by the reference desk with a cart loaded with boxes. Follow me, he said quietly, leading her to a corner table partially hidden by shelves. These files were part of a larger declassification project focusing on Operation Rolling Thunder. But when your request came through, something interesting happened. Certain documents were suddenly flagged for review. By whom? That's just it. The orders came through unofficial channels. No paperwork, no proper authorization chain. Just strongly worded suggestions from people who shouldn't even know about your request. Megan felt a chill run down her spine. What are they trying to hide? David began carefully unpacking the boxes. That's what we're going to find out. But Ms. McCain, are you sure you want to do this? Once you start down this path, Megan thought of her father's face in those last months. The way he'd sometimes stare into space during family dinners, lost in memories he wouldn't share. She thought of the nightmares that plagued him, the ones that made him cry out in languages she didn't understand. I'm sure, she said firmly. Where do we start? David pulled out a thick folder labeled Operation Rolling Thunder, Squadron Activities, Oct. 1967. We start with the official story. Then we look for what doesn't fit. As they began sorting through the documents, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than she'd imagined. Her father's words echoed in her mind. The truth about October 26, 1967, isn't what they think. She glanced at her watch. 10:47 a.m. In the coming hours, everything she thought she knew about her father's story would begin to unravel, piece by carefully hidden piece. The reading room's silence was broken only by the rustle of papers and the occasional cough from other researchers. David methodically organized documents into chronological order, creating a timeline of events leading up to October 26. Your father's mission that day was part of a larger bombing campaign, he explained, pointing to a flight roster. But look at this. His target assignment was changed last minute. No explanation given. Megan leaned closer, studying the document. Who had the authority to make that kind of change? That's what's strange. The authorization signature is missing. In fact, a lot of the standard documentation for that day seems to be incomplete. A tall man in a dark suit walked past their table, seemingly absorbed in his phone conversation. David waited until he was out of earshot before continuing. Ms. McCain, what do you know about the events leading up to your father's capture? Just what's in the official record. He was shot down during a bombing run over Hanoi. His plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire. David pulled out another document, this one marked with multiple classified stamps. That's the public version. But these after-action reports tell a different story. The anti-aircraft positions that day, they weren't where they were supposed to be. What do you mean? According to intelligence reports from the previous week, the North Vietnamese had their primary air defenses concentrated in a different sector. But on October 26th, they suddenly shifted their positions. It's as if they knew exactly where to wait. Megan finished, her voice barely a whisper. The implications made her stomach turn. She opened her father's journal again, flipping through the pages until she found an entry from 1975, written after his release. Some nights I still hear the radar lock warning. Sometimes I wonder if I could have done anything differently. But these days, I'm starting to think the real question is, why was I really there? A young woman approached their table, pushing a cart of documents. Excuse me, Mr. Chen. Dr. Harrison asked me to bring these up from the restricted section. David frowned. I didn't request any additional files. She said you'd need them for your research with Ms. McCain. The woman glanced nervously between them before hurrying away. What was that about? Megan asked. David carefully opened the new box. His eyes widened. These are signal intelligence transcripts from the day your father was shot down. They shouldn't be here. These files are still classified. Then why? Someone wants us to see them. He pulled out a manila envelope. But the question is, are they showing us the truth? Or are they trying to lead us down the wrong path? The morning stretched into afternoon as they carefully pieced together the puzzle. Each document seemed to raise more questions than answers. Megan's notebook, filled with names, dates, and connections that didn't quite make sense. Yet, at 2:30, David's phone buzzed. He read the message with a deepening frown. What is it? Megan asked. Security alert. Someone's been accessing classified files about your father's squadron from an unauthorized terminal. He looked up at her. We're being watched. Should we stop? David glanced at the boxes still unopened on their cart. No, but we need to be smart about this. Take only what's essential. I'll make copies of the key documents. As he stood to go to the copying machine, he paused. Ms. McCain, whatever we find, there's no going back. Are you prepared for that? Megan thought of her father's words from that last conversation in his study. Sometimes the enemy isn't always who you think it is. I'm prepared, she said. The truth is worth any price. David nodded and gathered the most important files. As he walked to the copier, Megan noticed another man in a dark suit enter the reading room, pretending to browse the shelves while watching their table. She opened her father's journal one more time, searching for any clues she might have missed. A small piece of paper fluttered out. A photograph she hadn't noticed before. It showed her father standing with his squadron mates before that fateful mission. But it was the background that caught her eye. A partially visible tail number on an aircraft that shouldn't have been there. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture that would change everything. But as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the reading room windows, Meghan McCain had no idea just how deep the conspiracy went, or how many powerful people would try to stop her from uncovering the truth about what really happened on October 26, 1967. David returned with the copies, his face grave. "Ms. McCain, there's something else you need to see. But not here. Meet me at the coffee shop across the street in an hour." As Meghan gathered her things, she could feel the weight of unseen eyes following her every move. The truth about her father's story was finally within reach, but she was beginning to understand why some people wanted it to stay buried. She clutched her father's journal closer, remembering his words about the cost of truth. Whatever she discovered in those archives would change not just her family's history, but perhaps the entire narrative of the Vietnam War itself. The story was just beginning, and the real revelations were yet to come. The coffee shop across the street was crowded with afternoon customers, mostly government employees seeking their caffeine fix. Meghan found a quiet corner table and ordered a black coffee she knew she wouldn't drink. Her hands were shaking too much. Her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. "This time," she answered. "Ms. McCain." The voice was male, elderly, with a slight southern drawl. "I understand you're looking into your father's service record. Who is this?" "A friend of your father's. Someone who was there." A pause. "You need to stop digging." "Why? What are you afraid I'll find?" "It's not about fear, Miss McCain. It's about protecting people who are still alive. Some secrets. They protect more than just reputations." The line went dead. Meghan stared at her phone, her heart pounding. When David finally walked in, she practically jumped out of her seat. "Were you followed?" she asked as he sat down. "Probably." He placed a manila envelope on the table. "But they're not trying to stop us. Not yet. They're watching to see what we find." "I just got a call." "Don't tell me," he interrupted. "The less I know about outside contact, the better." He opened the envelope and pulled out a single photograph. "This is what I wanted to show you." The image was grainy, obviously taken from a distance. It showed her father's A4E Skyhawk moments before it was hit. But something was off about the composition. "Look at the background," David said quietly. Meghan squinted at the photo. Behind her father's plane, partially obscured by clouds, were two other aircraft. They weren't North Vietnamese MiGs. "Are those American planes?" David nodded grimly. "F-4 Phantoms. They shouldn't have been there. According to official records, your father's mission was a solo run. Could they have been escort fighters? Not, according to the flight logs. And look at their position. They're not in escort formation. They're..." He hesitated. "They're what?" "They're tracking him." The implications hit Meghan like a physical blow. She remembered all the times her father had woken up screaming, not from memories of torture, but from what he called the shadow planes. "There's more," David continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found a partial transcript of radio communications from that day. Just before your father was shot down, there was a coded message sent from one of those phantoms. 'Package is in position.' A barista dropped a cup nearby, making them both jump. Meghan noticed more men in dark suits entering the coffee shop. "We need to move," David said, gathering the materials. "They're closing in." "Who are they?" "I don't know exactly, but they've been watching the archives ever since you filed your request." He handed her a business card with a handwritten address on the back. "Meet me here tonight at 8. Don't tell anyone where you're going." As they stood to leave, an elderly man at the next table caught Meghan's eye. He was wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap, and his hands were shaking slightly as he raised his coffee cup. "Miss," he called out softly. "Your father. He was a good man. Too good." Before she could respond, David was hurrying her toward the door. Outside, the autumn wind had turned colder, carrying the first hints of rain. "David," she said as they prepared to part ways, "what exactly are we dealing with here?" He looked around nervously before answering. "I think your father was betrayed, Ms. McCain. And I think the people responsible are still in power." Back in Sati-1, her car, Megan sat for a long moment, trying to process everything. The photograph seemed to burn in her bag, its implications threatening to unravel everything she thought she knew about her father's story. Her phone rang again. Her mother this time. "Megan, where are you? There are people here asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "About your father's papers. They say they're from naval intelligence, but something feels wrong." Cindy's voice dropped to a whisper. "Honey, they're going through his study." "What? They can't do that." "They have some kind of warrant." "Megan, what have you gotten yourself into?" Before she could answer, she noticed a black SUV pulling up behind her car. Two men in suits stepped out. "Mom, I have to go. Don't tell them anything. And whatever you do, don't let them take Dad's files." She started her car just as one of the men approached her window. The engine roared to life, and she pulled out into traffic, watching in her rearview mirror as the SUV followed. The chase was on, but Meghan McCain wasn't about to let her father's truth stay buried. As she navigated through the DC traffic, her mind raced with questions. Who were these people? What were they trying to hide? And most importantly, what had really happened to her father on that October day in 1967? The rain began to fall as she made her way through the city, the black SUV always 3 cars behind. Her father's journal sat heavy in her bag, its secrets now more precious and more dangerous than ever. The fluorescent lights in the reading room buzzed incessantly as Megan spread the newly acquired documents across the massive oak table. Her hands trembled slightly. She hadn't slept in 36 hours, surviving on vending machine coffee and determination. The events of yesterday's chase through DC had left her rattled, but more resolved than ever. "You look like you could use this," David said, placing a fresh cup of coffee beside her. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept much either. "Thanks." She took a sip, grimacing at the bitter taste. "Any news about the men who followed me?" David glanced around the empty reading room before answering. "They used diplomatic credentials to enter the building this morning. Claimed to be from State Department archives. But they weren't. Not unless State Department archivists started carrying concealed weapons." He pulled out a chair, the screech echoing through the quiet space. "We need to work fast. I don't know how long I can keep stalling Dr. Harrison's review of these files." Megan nodded, pulling out her father's journal. "Where do we start?" "With these." David carefully laid out a series of aerial photographs, their edges worn with age. These were taken during Operation Rolling Thunder, standard reconnaissance shots, or at least that's what they were labeled as. Megan leaned forward, studying the black and white images. They showed familiar landscapes, the skies over Hanoi, anti-aircraft positions, potential targets. But something caught her eye in one of the photos. "Wait," she said, picking up one image. "This timestamp, October 26th, 1967. This was taken the day my father was shot down." David pulled out a magnifying glass. "Look at the positioning of these anti-aircraft batteries. According to official records, they were supposed to be here." He pointed to one section of the photo. "But in this image, they're clustered here instead, right along your father's flight path. Could they have moved them? In less than 24 hours? Without our intelligence noticing?" He shook his head. "Someone knew exactly where your father would be flying that day." A door slammed somewhere in the archives, making them both jump. Footsteps echoed down the corridor outside. "Ms. McCain," a familiar voice called out. Dr. Harrison appeared in the doorway, her perfectly pressed suit at odds with the dusty archive environment. "I wasn't aware you'd be back today." "Dr. Harrison?" Megan replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm just following up on some research. Of course. The older woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Chen, there's a small matter requiring your attention in the restricted section. David stood slowly. I'm in the middle of assisting Ms. McCain. Now please. As David reluctantly followed Dr. Harrison out, Megan noticed him slip something under one of the folders. A small keycard with a handwritten note. Once alone, she carefully retrieved it. The note read, Sub-Basement B, Row 47, Box 1149. Go now. Megan's heart raced. The sub-basements weren't open to researchers. They housed the most sensitive materials, the ones that hadn't been cleared for public viewing. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her things and headed for the elevator. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Sometimes the most important truths are hidden in plain sight, honey. You just have to be brave enough to look. The elevator required a keycard for the sub-basement levels. Megan's hands shook slightly as she swiped David's card, praying it would work. The light turned green, and the elevator began its descent. Sub-basement B was a maze of towering metal shelves, the air heavy with the smell of old paper and secrets. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously as she made her way down the rows, counting numbers. Row 45, Row 46, Row 47. Box 1149 was smaller than she expected, tucked between larger containers on a middle shelf. Inside was a single manila envelope, unmarked except for a small red stamp. Eyes only. Mac V. Sog. Looking for something specific? Megan spun around. An elderly man stood at the end of the row, leaning on a cane. His security badge identified him as Walter Morris, Senior Archivist. I have authorization to be here, she stammered, holding up David's keycard. Do you now? Morris stepped closer, his cane tapping against the concrete floor. You know, I knew your father. Not well, mind you, but I was there that day, October 26th, 1967. I was a signals analyst at MACV headquarters. Megan's breath caught. You were there? Mm-hmm. He glanced at the box in her hands. Found something interesting in there. I don't know yet. Morris nodded slowly. You know, your father wasn't the only pilot shot down during Rolling Thunder, but he was the only one whose capture was preceded by a coded message from our own side. What are you saying? I'm saying, Ms. McCain, that you might want to look at the signal intelligence transcripts from that morning, particularly the communications between the Cap Patrol and Base Command. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and you might want to hurry. Security does hourly sweeps down here. Megan waited until his footsteps faded before opening the envelope, with trembling fingers. Inside were several pages of transcribed radio communications, along with a single photograph that made her blood run cold. The image showed her father's A4E Skyhawk moments before it was hit. But it wasn't alone. 2 American F-4 Phantoms were clearly visible in the background, their positions suggesting they weren't there to protect. Find what you were looking for? David's voice made her jump. He hurried down the aisle, looking worried. David, look at this. These planes. They were tracking him, weren't they? He studied the photo grimly. Yes, but it gets worse. He pulled out a folded paper from his pocket. I found this in Dr. Harrison's office while she was instructing me about proper archive procedures. It's a partial transcript of communications from one of those phantoms. Megan read the transcript, her hands shaking. 847. Target is on course. 0851. Package is in position. 0853. Green light authorized. Repeat, green light authorized. 0854. Static. Taking fire. Going down. They led him right into it, she whispered, feeling sick. But why? Who would... Ms. McCain. Dr. Harrison's voice echoed through the sub-basement. Security indicates your keycard was used down here. This area is restricted. We need to go, David said urgently. Take everything. They hurried through the maze of shelves, footsteps echoing behind them. At a junction, David pointed to a service elevator. That leads to the loading dock. My car's parked there. Go. What? About you? I'll stall them. Go. Megan clutched the documents to her chest and ran. Behind her, she could hear David's voice. Dr. Harrison, I was just looking for you. The service elevator was ancient and slow, each floor passing with agonizing sluggishness. When it finally opened onto the loading dock, Megan's heart nearly stopped. Two men in dark suits were waiting by a black SUV. Ms. McCain, one called out. We need to talk about what you found. She backed away, looking frantically for an escape route. Suddenly, a door behind her burst open. It was Morris, the elderly archivist. This way, he shouted, holding open a side door. Quickly! Megan didn't hesitate. She ran through the door as the men shouted behind her. Morris led her through a maze of maintenance corridors, moving surprisingly fast for his age. Your father was a good man, he said as they ran. Too good. That's why they chose him. Who chose him? Why? They emerged into a small parking lot behind the building. Morris pointed to a battered pickup truck. Get in. Drive to this address. He handed her a piece of paper. Someone there can explain everything. But, go. They're coming. Megan jumped into the truck, the engine roaring to life just as the men in suits burst through the door. In her rearview mirror, she saw Morris blocking their path with his cane, buying her precious seconds. As she merged into DC traffic, her mind raced. The photograph seemed to burn in her bag, evidence that her father's capture wasn't just bad luck or the fog of war. It was planned. But by whom? And why? Her phone rang. David, are you safe? He asked without preamble. Yes. Did they? They're questioning me now. Listen, there's something else you need to know. Those signal transcripts? They were coded using a cipher that only top-level military command had access to. What are you saying? I'm saying this. Goes all the way to the top, Ms. McCain. The highest levels of military command in 1967 knew about your father's mission. They wanted him shot down. The implications made her head spin. But that would mean... It means everything we thought we knew about that day is wrong. And Ms. McCain, be careful. The men who arranged this, some of them are still alive. Still, in power. The line went dead. Megan gripped the steering wheel tighter, checking her mirrors for any sign of pursuit. The address Morris had given her was in Alexandria, Virginia, about 30 minutes away in good traffic. She thought about calling her mother but decided against it. The less anyone knew about what she'd discovered, the safer they'd be. The photo and transcripts in her bag weren't just historical documents anymore. They were evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the military command structure. As she drove, her father's words from his journal echoed in her mind. The truth about October 26, 1967, isn't what they think. Now she understood why he'd written it down, but never spoken of it. The truth was too dangerous, too explosive to be revealed while certain people still held power. But John McCain was gone now, and his daughter was about to blow the lid off one of the biggest cover-ups in Vietnam War history. A black SUV appeared in her rearview mirror, matching her every lane change. Not this time, she muttered, making a sudden turn onto a side street. The chase was on again. But this time, Megan had something they desperately wanted. Proof that American pilots had been deliberately sacrificed for some greater scheme, with her father as the prime target. The real question now wasn't just who had betrayed him, but why. What was so important that they would sacrifice their own pilots? And who were they trying to protect after all these years? The answers were waiting at that address in Alexandria. But first, she had to shake her pursuers. As rain began to fall, on the Capitol streets, Megan McCain gripped the steering wheel tighter, determined to uncover the truth her father had taken to his grave. The rain was falling harder now as Megan navigated through Alexandria's narrow streets. She'd managed to lose the SUV by ducking through a series of residential neighborhoods, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The address led her to an old brick building that had seen better days. A faded sign read, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Post 3102. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few old cars. Inside, the air smelled of stale beer and forgotten memories. A few elderly men sat at the bar, watching a baseball game on a dated TV. One of them, wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap, looked up as she entered. "You must be McCain's girl," he said quietly. Walter called ahead. "How did you know you were coming?" He stood slowly, favoring his left leg. "Because we've been waiting for someone to start asking the right questions for about 50 years now." He extended his hand. "Colonel James Murphy, retired. I flew with your father's squadron." Megan shook his hand, noting the firm grip despite his age. "You knew my father?" "Knew him. Hell, I was supposed to fly his mission that day." Murphy gestured toward a back room. "But let's talk somewhere more private." The back room was set up for meetings, with folding chairs and old military photos on the walls. Murphy locked the door behind them. "Show me what you found," he said without preamble. Megan pulled out the photograph and transcripts. Murphy studied them under the fluorescent light, his hands trembling slightly. "Jesus," he whispered. "They really kept these." He looked up at her. "Do you understand what you're looking at?" "I think so. Those F-4s were tracking my father's plane. They led him into a trap." Murphy nodded slowly. "But do you know why?" Before she could answer, there was a knock at the door. Murphy tensed, reaching for something under his jacket. "Jim, it's Tom. They're here." Murphy relaxed slightly. "Come in." The door opened to reveal another elderly veteran, accompanied by David Chen. He looked disheveled but unhurt. "Ms. McCain," David said quickly, "we need to move everything to a secure location. They're searching the archives building top to bottom." "Who's searching?" "Military intelligence, CIA, people who shouldn't care about 50-year-old mission reports." He paused. "Unless those reports hide something they don't want found." Murphy wheeled over a projector screen. "Show her the rest, David." David pulled out more documents from his messenger bag. These were hidden in a misfiled maintenance log. Operation Crimson Tide, a top-secret program run by military intelligence during Vietnam. He spread the papers across a table. Megan's heart nearly stopped when she saw her father's name on a list titled Priority Assets. "What is this?" Murphy sat heavily in a chair. "In '67, we had a network of deep-cover agents in North Vietnam. Good ones, placed high up in their military command. But the North Vietnamese were getting suspicious. They needed a distraction, something big enough to draw attention away from some inconsistencies they'd noticed. They needed a hero," David added quietly. "Someone who would be captured but wouldn't break under torture. Someone whose story would be so compelling it would overshadow everything else." Megan felt sick. "They chose my father. They chose several pilots," Murphy said. "Your father wasn't the only one, but he was the highest priority. Son of an admiral, third-generation military man. They knew he'd never break, no matter what they did to him. But how could they be sure? Because they had his psychological profile. They knew exactly what kind of man he was." Murphy's voice cracked. "They knew he'd rather die than betray his country, even if his country had betrayed him." A loud bang from the main room made them all jump. David rushed to the door, peeking out. "Multiple men in suits," he whispered. "Coming this way." Murphy moved with surprising speed for his age, pulling up a section of carpet to reveal a trap door. "Quick, down here. There's a tunnel that leads to the next building." "What about the documents?" Megan asked, gathering them up. "Leave copies," David said, pulling out duplicates from his bag. "Let them find what we want them to find." As they hurried down into the tunnel, Megan could hear voices above. "Federal agents, open up!" The tunnel was narrow and damp, lit only by emergency lights that cast everything in a sickly green glow. They moved as quickly as they could, Murphy leading the way despite his limp. "Your father wasn't just a prisoner of war," he said as they walked. "He was a pawn in a much bigger game. The agents we had in place, The intelligence they provided saved thousands of American lives. The brass decided it was worth sacrificing a few pilots to protect that network. But why didn't he ever say anything after he got back? Because they showed him the numbers, David said. The lives saved, the mission succeeded, all because of the intelligence from those agents. They made him believe his sacrifice had meaning. They emerged in the basement of an abandoned warehouse. Murphy led them to a room filled with old filing cabinets. "This is where we kept the real records," he said, pulling out a key. "Everything the government wouldn't admit to. We were just junior officers then, but we knew something wasn't right. So we made copies, kept evidence." He opened a cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "This is everything about Operation Crimson Tide. The pilots they sacrificed, the agents they protected, the decisions made in rooms where no records were supposed to exist." Megan took the folder with trembling hands. "Why are you showing me this now?" Murphy looked at her with tired eyes. "Because the men who ran this operation? Most of them are dead now. But some aren't. Some went on to even higher positions, and they're still protecting their secrets." David's phone buzzed. He checked it and paled. "They're searching the VFW building. We need to move. Take the service exit," Murphy said, pointing to a metal door. "There's a car waiting. The driver knows where to take you. You're not coming?" He shook his head. "I'm too old for running. Besides, someone needs to stay and feed them a story." He gripped Megan's hand. "Your father was a hero, Ms. McCain. Not because of what they did to him, but because of how he handled it. He protected the truth until it was safe to be revealed. And is it safe now?" "No," Murphy said grimly. "But it's necessary. The people behind this, they're still making the same kinds of decisions today. Still sacrificing good people for what they call the greater good." Footsteps echoed from above. David grabbed Megan's arm. "We have to go. Now." As they hurried toward the exit, Murphy called out softly, "Ms. McCain, when this all comes out, make sure they remember not just what was done to your father, but why. The truth isn't just about the past. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again." 3 days without sleep had taken their toll on Megan. She sat in a dimly lit motel room just outside D.C., surrounded by stacks of files they'd taken from Murphy's archive. Her father's journal lay open beside her, its pages now holding new meaning. A knock at the door made her reach for her phone. The agreed-upon pattern. 2 quick taps. Pause. 3 slow. "It's me." David's voice came through quietly. She opened the door, noting his disheveled appearance. "Any news?" "They're watching your house," he said, dropping his messenger bag on the bed. "Your mother called. They've got some story about a routine national security review of your father's papers." "Routine?" Megan laughed bitterly. "Since when does a routine review involve armed men in SUVs?" "Since we found this." David pulled out a stack of maintenance reports. "It took me all night to figure out why these were misfiled. Look at the signature on the bottom of page 47. Megan's hands trembled as she read the name. Admiral James Holloway III, Chief of Naval Operations. This was buried in routine maintenance logs? "The perfect hiding place," David said, spreading the papers across the small motel desk. "Nobody looks too closely at engine inspection reports from 50 years ago. But this..." He pointed to a section marked with a faded red stamp. "This is what they've been trying to hide." The memo was dated October 1967, just days before her father's capture. Its header read, "Operation Crimson Tide. Asset Selection Parameters." "My God," Megan whispered as she read. They actually put it in writing. The memo detailed the criteria for selecting pilots who would become acceptable losses to protect deeper intelligence assets in North Vietnam. Her father's name appeared on a list of primary candidates, along with psychological assessments and family background information. "They chose him because they knew he wouldn't break," David said quietly. His psychological profile showed extreme resilience, unshakable loyalty. "They used his strength against him." Megan's voice cracked. She thought of all those years her father had spent in captivity, never knowing he'd been deliberately sacrificed. A phone buzzed. One of the burner phones they'd bought. David answered, listening intently. "We have a problem," he said after hanging up. "My contact at the archives. They're doing a complete audit of all files accessed in the past week. They know we found something." Megan ran her hands through her hair, exhaustion warring with determination. "How long do we have?" "Hours. Maybe less." Once they traced the document chain, another knock at the door. Not the agreed pattern. They both froze. "Ms. McCain?" A woman's voice, unfamiliar. "My name is Sarah Holloway. I believe you have something that belonged to my grandfather." David reached for his bag, but Megan held up a hand. She approached the door cautiously. "Admiral Holloway's granddaughter." "Yes, and I can help you understand what you found. But we need to talk somewhere safe." Megan opened the door a crack. A woman in her 40s stood there, bearing a striking resemblance to photos she'd seen of the Admiral in his younger days. "Why should we trust you?" David asked from behind Megan. "Because," Sarah said, holding up an aged envelope, "I have the other half of that memo. The part that explains why they really chose your father." 20 minutes later, they sat in Sarah's car parked in an empty church lot. The second half of the memo lay between them like a live bomb. "My grandfather kept this hidden for decades," Sarah explained. "He was dying when he finally told me the truth. The guilt ate at him all those years." "Guilt about what?" Megan asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "About using good men as pawns." Sarah opened the envelope carefully. Operation Crimson Tide wasn't just about protecting intelligence assets. It was about creating a specific kind of hero. Someone whose captivity would capture America's attention so completely that no one would look too closely at other operations happening at the same time. "What other operations?" "Have you ever heard of McVSOG?" David nodded. "Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. They ran covert ops. They ran something much bigger in '67, Sarah said. Something that required complete deniability and a major distraction. Your father." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your father's capture wasn't just about protecting existing assets. It was about covering up a massive intelligence operation that went deep into North Vietnamese high command." Megan felt sick. They used him as a smokescreen? They used several pilots that way. But your father was special. They knew his story would be compelling. The son of an admiral. The naval aviator following in his father's footsteps. The press would follow every detail of his captivity, his family's vigil. It would become the story everyone focused on. While McVSOG did what? Sarah glanced around the empty parking lot before answering. They had operatives inside the North Vietnamese Politburo. Deep cover agents who'd spent years working their way into positions of trust. The intelligence they provided saved countless lives. But if they were discovered, the whole network would collapse. David finished. Exactly. So, they needed something big enough to distract both the American press and North Vietnamese counterintelligence. They needed heroes who could survive years of captivity without breaking, whose stories would dominate the headlines. Megan opened her father's journal, turning to an entry from 1973, shortly after his release. "Sometimes I wonder if it was worth it. All the pain, all the years lost. But then I think about the men who didn't come home. And I tell myself it had to mean something. There had to be a reason." "There was a reason," Sarah said softly. "But not the one he thought." David's burner phone buzzed again. His face went pale as he read the message. "They found the maintenance logs. They know what we have." Sarah started the car. "We need to move. There's somewhere else we need to go. Somewhere my grandfather left more evidence." "Why are you helping us?" Megan asked as they pulled out of the parking lot. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Because some secrets shouldn't stay buried forever, and because my grandfather never forgave himself for his part in it. This was his way of making it right." They drove through the darkening city, taking a circuitous route to avoid surveillance. Megan thought about her father's nightmares, his occasional distant stares, the things he'd never said. How much had he suspected? How much had he figured out over the years? There's something else, Sarah said as they turned onto a quiet residential street. Something that wasn't in either half of the memo. The operation. It didn't end with Vietnam. What do you mean? The template they created, using high-profile casualties to cover deeper operations. It worked so well they kept using it. Different wars, different heroes, but the same basic playbook. Are you saying they're still doing this? Sarah pulled into a driveway of an ordinary-looking house. I'm saying some of the men who planned Operation Crimson Tide went on to very powerful positions they still hold today. Inside the house, Sarah led them to a small home office. She pulled out a key and unlocked a hidden wall safe. My grandfather left these here. Documentation of everything. Not just Vietnam, but operations in every conflict since then. Names, dates, decisions made in rooms where no records were supposed to exist. As she opened the safe, David's phone buzzed one final time. He looked at Megan, his face grim. They're here. Multiple vehicles approaching from both ends of the street. Sarah worked quickly, pulling files from the safe. We don't have much time. These need to be protected. They're the only proof left. Proof of what? Megan asked, helping her gather the documents. Of how deep this really goes. Look at this. Sarah handed her a folder marked Post-Vietnam Operations. Inside were photographs and documents linking Operation Crimson Tide's architects to similar operations in conflicts spanning decades. Each page revealed a pattern. Carefully selected servicemen whose captures or losses served larger, hidden purposes. My father. Megan's voice caught. Did he ever figure it out? Towards the end, I think he did, Sarah said, pulling out more files. That's why they were watching him so closely in his final years. They were afraid he'd... Headlights swept across the windows. David peered through the blinds. 3 SUVs. Same ones from the archives. There's a way out, Sarah said, moving to a bookshelf. My grandfather had this house built with an escape route. Cold War paranoia, but it might save us now. She pulled a specific book, and the shelf clicked, revealing a narrow passage. Take everything, Sarah ordered, shoving files into a waterproof bag. These aren't just historical records. They're active cases. Proof that they're still doing it today. A loud knock echoed through the house. Federal agents, open up! Megan's hand shook as she helped gather the last files. One photo caught her eye. Her father in his later years at a Senate hearing. The date stamp showed it was just months before his death. He was investigating them, she realized. That's what those late-night meetings were about. The classified briefings. He was getting close, Sarah confirmed, sealing the bag. Too close. Now you know why those nightmares got worse near the end. Another knock, harder this time. Ms. Holloway, we know you're in there. We have a warrant. David checked his phone. Back door's covered too. This way, Sarah whispered, leading them into the passage. It lets out in the garage of the house behind us. There's a car waiting. My friend's been watching in case this happened. The passage was narrow and dark, lit only by their phone screens. As Sarah closed the bookshelf behind them, they could hear the front door being breached. What about you? Megan asked as they hurried through the tunnel. I'll stall them. Buy you time. Sarah handed her a key. This opens a storage unit in Baltimore. Unit 247. Everything else you need to know is in there. She grabbed Megan's arm. But be careful who you trust with this. Some of the men named in those files. They're still in positions of power. Very high positions. They emerged into a garage where an old Subaru waited. A middle-aged woman sat behind the wheel. Get in, she said tersely. They've got the whole block surrounded. As they climbed in, Sarah held back. Margaret here will get you to Baltimore. After that, she pressed a burner phone into Megan's hand. Call the number in it. Only after you've seen what's in the storage unit. Sarah, go! They can't know you were here. As they pulled out of the garage, Megan looked back to see Sarah walking calmly toward the federal agents now swarming her house. In the growing distance, she could hear Sarah's voice. Gentlemen, do you have any idea what time it is? Margaret drove skillfully, taking back roads and switching cars twice before they felt safe enough to talk. I was Oni, she said finally. Office of Naval Intelligence. Worked with Sarah's grandfather back in the day. Saw things that didn't add up. About Operation Crimson Tide. David asked from the back seat. About everything that came after. The template they created in Vietnam. It became a playbook. Need to hide a covert operation? Create a hero. Need to distract from something bigger? Sacrifice someone whose story will capture public attention. Megan thought about the files now hidden in their waterproof bag. How many? How many others like my father? Too many. Margaret's grip tightened on the steering wheel. And it's still happening. Different wars, different faces, but the same game. The files you're carrying, they're not just history. They're current operations. The implications made Megan's head spin. Her father's last words to her took on new meaning. Sometimes the enemy isn't who you think it is. They drove through the night, taking a circuitous route to Baltimore. Dawn was breaking when they finally reached the storage facility. I'll keep watch, Margaret said, parking across the street. But hurry, they'll have figured out where you're headed by now. Unit 247 was at the back of the facility. Inside, they found more than just files. There were recordings, computer drives, and a sealed envelope addressed to Megan. Inside was a letter, written in Admiral Holloway's shaking hand. Ms. McCain, if you're reading this, you've discovered the truth about your father's capture. But what you found is just the beginning. Operation Crimson Tide never ended. It just evolved. The men who planned it moved up the ranks, spreading their influence. They're still there, still making the same choices, still sacrificing good people for what they call the greater good. Your father began to suspect the truth in his final years. That's why he kept that journal, why he left those breadcrumbs for you to follow. He knew you would understand what had to be done. The evidence in this unit isn't just about Vietnam. It's about every major conflict since then. The pattern is there, if you know where to look. But be careful. Some of the names in these files belong to men who now sit in the highest offices of power. Your father was a hero, Ms. McCain. Not because of what they did to him, but because he never broke, never compromised, even when he began to suspect the truth. Now, it's your turn to decide what to do with that truth. Choose wisely and watch your back. James Holloway III. Megan's hands trembled as she read the letter again. The weight of the truth and the responsibility that came with it felt overwhelming. David's phone buzzed with a warning from Margaret. Company coming. Multiple vehicles. They had to decide quickly what to take, what to leave, and most importantly, what to do with the truth they'd uncovered. The story wasn't just about her father anymore. It was about a system that had been operating in the shadows for decades, using heroes as pawns in a game most Americans never knew existed. Megan sat in her Georgetown apartment, surrounded by the evidence they'd gathered. Photographs, documents, and transcripts covered every surface of her dining room table. Her father's journal lay open beside her laptop, its pages now holding answers to questions she'd never thought to ask. The decision to go public weighed heavily on her mind. 5 days had passed since their escape from the Baltimore storage facility, and she hadn't slept more than a few hours at a time. Her phone rang. Her mother again. The 7th call today. Mom, I'm okay, she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. Honey, there are men here again. They're saying things about your father's service record, about national security implications. What kind of things? They're claiming he might have been, Cindy's voice cracked, that he might have been compromised during his captivity. They're trying to discredit him before you even say anything. Megan's hand tightened on the phone. They're scared, Mom. They know what I found. What exactly did you find? Cindy whispered. Megan, what aren't you telling me? Before she could answer, someone knocked at her door. Her heart jumped until she heard David's voice. It's me. Quick. She let him in, noting his disheveled appearance and the fresh bandage on his arm. What happened? They picked me up outside the archives, he said, dropping his messenger bag. 2 guys in a black SUV. I managed to get away, but... He gestured to his arm. They're not playing games anymore. Megan's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. CNN reporting break-in at Naval Archives. They're setting the stage. They're going to pin it all on us, David said, watching the news feed on Megan's laptop. Make it look like we're conspiracy theorists who stole classified documents. Let them try. Megan pulled out the memo they'd found. Admiral Holloway's signature still clear at the bottom. We have proof. Proof that's 50 years old. They'll say it's fake, that we doctored it. Then we'll show them these. She opened a folder marked Current Operations. Inside were documents linking Operation Crimson Tide's methods to modern-day military operations. They're still doing it, David. Still sacrificing people to cover their tracks. Another knock at the door. This one harder, more insistent. Ms. McCain. A male voice called out. Federal agents, we need to talk. David quickly gathered the most important documents. Back door, now. But Megan didn't move. She stood staring at her father's Purple Heart on the wall, remembering his words about standing up for truth no matter the cost. No, she said firmly. No more running. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd been staring at for days. The Washington Post's investigative desk. This is Megan McCain, she said when someone answered. I have a story about Vietnam, about my father, and about operations that are still active today. And I have proof. The pounding on the door grew louder. Ms. McCain, last chance to open up. The voice on the phone spoke quickly. Can you get to our offices? Yes, but I'll need protection. There are federal agents at my door right now. Get here with your evidence. We'll have security waiting. David grabbed her arm. Megan, think about this. Once it goes public, I am thinking about it. She gathered the files into her father's old briefcase. Those men out there, they're counting on fear to keep their secrets. That's how they've operated for 50 years. It stops now. The door shuddered under another impact. Backstairs, David said, accepting her decision. I'll hold them off. Buy you time. David, go. The story has to get out. Everything we found, everything your father went through. People need to know. As Megan hurried down the back stairs, she could hear the door finally giving way. David's voice echoed down the stairwell. Gentlemen, I believe you're executing an illegal search. The night air was cool as she emerged into the alley behind her building. A black SUV sat idling nearby, but its occupants were focused on the front entrance. She slipped past, keeping to the shadows. Her phone buzzed. A text from Margaret. Car waiting 2 blocks south. White Prius. Get in back seat. The streets of Georgetown were quiet, but Megan could feel eyes watching from every window. The weight of the briefcase seemed to grow with each step. The white Prius was where Margaret promised, its engine running. An elderly man sat behind the wheel. She recognized him from the VFW. Murphy. Surprised to see me? He asked as she climbed in. Figured you'd need one last ride. They hurt David, she said as they pulled away. He knew the risks. We all did. Murphy navigated through the dark streets. Your father. He was starting to put it together at the end. That's why they watched him so closely in his final years. Did he ever try to go public? He was building up to it, gathering evidence, making connections. But he ran out of time. Murphy checked the rearview mirror. 2 SUVs, 6 cars back. They're being subtle about it. Megan clutched the briefcase, tighter. Inside were decades of secrets. of lies wrapped in patriotism, of good people sacrificed for shadowy purposes. "Why did you keep all this evidence?" she asked. "Why not come forward sooner?" Murphy was quiet for a moment. "Because we weren't sure anyone would believe us. But your father, he was different. A war hero, a senator, a man above reproach. If he had lived to tell this story, then I'll tell it for him." They approached the Washington Post building. Security guards were already waiting outside. "Ms. McCain," Murphy said as they pulled up, "what you're about to do, there's no going back. These men, they've buried their secrets for half a century. They won't stop trying to discredit you, to paint you as unstable or attention-seeking. Let them try." She gripped the briefcase. "My father survived 5.5 years of torture to protect what he thought was right. I can handle whatever they throw at me." As she stepped out of the car, her phone lit up with a message from David. "I'm okay. They're trying to get a warrant for your arrest. Don't stop." The security guards escorted her inside as black SUVs screeched to a halt outside. Men in suits emerged, shouting about national security and classified documents. But it was too late. The truth about Vietnam, about Operation Crimson Tide, about decades of using heroes as pawns. It was all about to come out. In the elevator, Megan opened her father's journal one last time. On the last page, below his cryptic note about October 26, 1967, she found words she hadn't noticed before. "The truth demands courage, not just to uncover it, but to face what it reveals about who we really are." The elevator doors opened to reveal a team of waiting reporters. As Megan stepped out, carrying decades of secrets in her father's briefcase, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. The truth about Vietnam was about to change forever, and John McCain's legacy would finally be understood for what it really was, not just a story of heroic survival, but a testament to the complex, often dark choices made in the name of national security. And somewhere, she hoped, her father was watching, finally at peace with the truth he'd carried for so long. "All right," she said to the waiting reporters. "Let's begin at the beginning. On October 26, 1967, my father's plane was shot down over Hanoi. But that's not the real story. The real story is why he was there, and who put him there." The next few hours passed in a blur of questions, documents, and recorded statements. The Post's conference room had become a command center, with reporters and fact-checkers poring over every piece of evidence. "Ms. McCain," the lead investigative reporter, Michael Chen, said, holding up Admiral Holloway's memo, "Do you understand what this means? This isn't just about Vietnam. This document proves that military command knowingly sacrificed American pilots." "Not just pilots," Megan replied, pulling out more files. "Look at these. The same pattern repeats in every major conflict since Vietnam. Different names, different wars, but the same playbook." Outside the building, the crowd of federal agents had grown. Through the windows, Megan could see them arguing with the Post's legal team. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "They're claiming national security, trying to get an emergency injunction to stop publication." "Let me guess," Michael said, noting her expression. "They're playing the national security card. They always do," a voice said from the doorway. Sarah Holloway stood there, looking tired but determined. "It's their favorite tool. Wrap everything in classified labels and hope no one looks too closely." "How did you get in?" Megan asked, surprised. "Through the loading dock. Your mother's here too." Cindy McCain entered behind Sarah, her face a mix of worry and pride. "Honey, are you sure about this? They're saying terrible things on the news." "I'm sure, Mom." Megan handed her father's journal to Michael. "Tell them what you found in the archives." "They're already spinning it," Michael said, flipping through the journal. "Claiming you stole classified documents, that you're part of some conspiracy theory group." "Of course they are," Sarah interjected. "My grandfather predicted exactly this response. That's why he kept copies of everything, protected by attorney-client privilege." A commotion outside drew their attention. More SUVs were arriving, These ones with diplomatic plates. State Department, Michael observed. They're pulling out all the stops. Megan's phone rang. Murphy. They're moving faster than we expected, he said without preamble. They're trying to classify everything retroactively. But they made a mistake. What mistake? They forgot about the FOIA requests we filed 20 years ago. Hundreds of them, through different channels. Some of those documents they're trying to classify. They're already part of the public record. Michael's team was working frantically, scanning documents and uploading them to secure servers. The story was growing beyond Vietnam, beyond even Operation Crimson Tide. Look at this. A young reporter called out, holding up a recent military dispatch. Same pattern in Afghanistan. A decorated officer's capture that diverted attention from a classified operation in Pakistan. And here, another added. Iraq, 2007. Another heroic sacrifice that covered up something bigger. Cindy picked up her husband's journal, running her fingers over his familiar handwriting. He knew, didn't he? Toward the end? He was putting it together. Megan said softly. That's why the nightmares got worse. He was remembering details, seeing patterns he'd missed before. The building's security chief entered with urgent news. They've got a federal judge on the way with an emergency injunction. How long? Michael asked. 20 minutes, maybe less. As she stepped out of the car, her phone lit up with a message from David. I'm okay. They're trying to get a warrant for your arrest. Don't stop. The security guards escorted her inside as black SUVs screeched to a halt outside. Men in suits emerged, shouting about national security and classified documents. But it was too late. The truth about Vietnam, about Operation Crimson Tide, about decades of using heroes as pawns. It was all about to come out. In the elevator, Megan opened her father's journal one last time. On the last page, below his cryptic note about October 26, 1967, she found words she hadn't noticed before. The truth demands courage, not just to uncover it, but to face what it reveals about who we really are. The elevator doors opened to reveal a team of waiting reporters. As Megan stepped out, carrying decades of secrets in her father's briefcase, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. The truth about Vietnam was about to change forever, and John McCain's legacy would finally be understood for what it really was. Not just a story of heroic survival, but a testament to the complex, often dark choices made in the name of national security. And somewhere, she hoped, her father was watching, finally at peace with the truth he'd carried for so long. All right, she said to the waiting reporters. Let's begin at the beginning. On October 26, 1967, my father's plane was shot down over Hanoi. But that's not the real story. The real story is why he was there, and who put him there. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions, documents, and recorded statements. The Post's conference room had become a command center, with reporters and fact-checkers poring over every piece of evidence. Ms. McCain, the lead investigative reporter, Michael Chen, said, holding up Admiral Holloway's memo. Do you understand what this means? This isn't just about Vietnam. This document proves that military command knowingly sacrificed American pilots. Not just pilots, Megan replied, pulling out more files. Look at these. The same pattern repeats in every major conflict since Vietnam. Different names, different wars, but the same playbook. Outside the building, the crowd of federal agents had grown. Through the windows, Megan could see them arguing with the Post's legal team. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. They're claiming national security, trying to get an emergency injunction to stop publication. Let me guess, Michael said, noting her expression. They're playing the national security card? They always do, a voice said from the doorway. Sarah Holloway stood there, looking tired but determined. It's their favorite tool. Wrap everything in classified labels and hope no one looks too closely. How did you get in? Megan asked, surprised. Through the loading dock, Your mother's here too. Cindy McCain entered behind Sarah, her face a mix of worry and pride. Honey, are you sure about this? They're saying terrible things on the news. I'm sure, Mom. Megan handed her father's journal to Michael. Tell them what you found in the archives. They're already spinning it, Michael said, flipping through the journal. Claiming you stole classified documents, that you're part of some conspiracy theory group. Of course they are, Sarah interjected. My grandfather predicted exactly this response. That's why he kept copies of everything, protected by attorney-client privilege. A commotion outside drew their attention. More SUVs were arriving, these ones with diplomatic plates. State Department, Michael observed. They're pulling out all the stops. Megan's phone rang. Murphy. They're moving faster than we expected, he said without preamble. They're trying to classify everything retroactively. But they made a mistake. What mistake? They forgot about the FOIA requests we filed 20 years ago. Hundreds of them, through different channels. Some of those documents they're trying to classify. They're already part of the public record. Michael's team was working frantically, scanning documents and uploading them to secure servers. The story was growing beyond Vietnam, beyond even Operation Crimson Tide. Look at this, a young reporter called out, holding up a recent military dispatch. Same pattern in Afghanistan. A decorated officer's capture that diverted attention from a classified operation in Pakistan. And here, another added, Iraq, 2007. Another heroic sacrifice that covered up something bigger. Cindy picked up her husband's journal, running her fingers over his familiar handwriting. He knew, didn't he? Toward the end, he was putting it together. Megan said softly. That's why the nightmares got worse. He was remembering details, seeing patterns he'd missed before. The building's security chief entered with urgent news. They've got a federal judge on the way with an emergency injunction. How long? Michael asked. 20 minutes, maybe less. Then we don't have much time. Megan stood, addressing the room. Everything we have needs to go live now. All of it. Megan, her mother cautioned. Once this is out. I know, Mom. But Dad always said that truth was worth any price. She turned to Michael. How fast can you publish? Give us 10 minutes to fact-check the crucial documents. Then we go live with everything. Sarah's phone buzzed. They're calling in favors at other newspapers, trying to discredit us before we publish, claiming this is all a publicity stunt. Let them, Megan said firmly. The documents speak for themselves. The next 10 minutes were a frenzy of activity. Reporters cross-referenced documents, verified signatures, and prepared the story for a publication. Outside, more official vehicles arrived, their lights painting the building's windows in red and blue. Finally, Michael looked up from his computer. It's ready. Ms. McCain, once I hit this button, do it. The story went live at 9:47 p.m. Eastern Time. Within minutes, phones throughout the room began buzzing with notifications as other news outlets picked up the story. CNN's running it. Someone called out. Reuters just picked it up. It's trending on social media. The truth about Vietnam, about Operation Crimson Tide, about decades of manufactured heroes and hidden operations. It was all out there now. Impossible to contain. Megan's phone rang one last time. An unknown number. She answered on speaker. Ms. McCain, a deep voice said. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Actually, I do, she replied calmly. I've done exactly what my father taught me to do. Stand up for truth, no matter the cost. There will be consequences. There already have been. 50 years of them. Now it's your turn to face them. She hung up as the first waves of reaction hit social media. The story was exploding, with thousands sharing and commenting. The truth about Vietnam was being rewritten in real time. Megan, her mother said softly, your father would be proud. Through the windows, they could see more media vans arriving. their satellite dishes rising into the night sky. The story was out, and nothing could put it back in the box. David arrived, his arm properly bandaged now, carrying more files. They're calling an emergency session of Congress. The revelations about current operations. It's causing chaos in multiple departments. Good, Megan said, watching the story spread across the world. It's time for some chaos. The truth about her father's sacrifice was finally known, but it was more than just a historical revelation. It was a warning about power, about the choices made in dark rooms, about the true cost of what some called necessary sacrifices. As reporters continued to pore through the documents, uncovering more connections and current operations, Megan thought about her father's last words to her. Sometimes the enemy isn't who you think it is. He had been right, and now the whole world would know just how right he had been. The night was just beginning, and the real storm was still to come. But for the first time since finding her father's journal, Meghan McCain felt at peace. The truth was out there, and no amount of government denials or classified stamps could hide it anymore. The cost would be high. She knew that. But as her father had proved during those long years in captivity, some things were worth any price. Near midnight, the Washington Post building was still buzzing with activity. The story had gone global, trending on every social media platform. Government spokespersons were scrambling to respond, their carefully crafted statements falling apart in the face of overwhelming evidence. "Look at this," Michael said, pointing to his screen. "Military forums are exploding. Veterans from multiple conflicts are coming forward with similar stories. It's not just Vietnam anymore," David added, scrolling through his phone. "The pattern they established with Operation Crimson Tide. People are finding it everywhere." Megan stood by the window, watching the crowd of reporters and photographers growing outside. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from journalists worldwide. "Ms. McCain," a young reporter called out. "The Senate Armed Services Committee just announced an emergency hearing." "Already?" Sarah looked up from her laptop. "That was faster than we expected." "They have to," Murphy said from his corner. Too many current operations were exposed. Too many questions about who's still using the same playbook. Cindy touched her daughter's arm. "Honey, are you ready for what comes next? This isn't going to be easy." Megan picked up her father's journal, its pages now scanned and shared with the world. "Dad endured 5.5 years of torture without breaking. I think I can handle some congressional hearings." Her phone rang, a secure line they'd set up earlier. The news made her pause. "They found more files," she announced to the room. "In a secure facility in Virginia. Decades of similar operations, all following the same template they created with Dad." "How high does this go?" Michael asked. "All the way to the top. Current officials, past presidents, military leaders. They all knew. They all approved similar operations." The implications were staggering. It wasn't just about Vietnam anymore, or even about John McCain. It was about a system that had been operating in the shadows for decades, using heroes as pawns in a game most Americans never knew existed. Outside, the first rays of dawn were beginning to light up the Washington sky. A new day was coming, and with it, a new understanding of American military history. "Look," Sarah said softly, pointing to her phone. "They're gathering at the Vietnam Memorial. Veterans, families. They want answers." Megan thought about all the other families, all the other heroes who had been used like her father. Their stories would come out now too. The truth couldn't be hidden anymore. "Ms. McCain," Michael said, approaching with his laptop. "We're ready to publish the follow-up piece, the one about current operations. Are you sure about this? Once it's out, do it," she said firmly. "All of it." As the sun rose over Washington, Meghan McCain stood in the Post's conference room, surrounded by the evidence of a 50-year conspiracy. Her father's words echoed in her mind. The truth demands courage, not just to uncover it, but to face what it reveals about who we really are. The truth about Vietnam had finally been revealed. And with it, the dark machinery that had been operating behind the scenes of American military power for half a century. John McCain's legacy would no longer be just about survival and heroism. It would be about the complex, often terrible choices made in the name of national security, and about the courage to finally expose them. "Ready?" David asked, holding the door. Outside, reporters waited to hear from John McCain's daughter about the story that had just rewritten American military history. Megan took a deep breath, clutching her father's journal. "Yes," she said. "It's time for the whole truth to come out."